And we are into the quarterfinals of Triad Wars 1. Turdz takes on my AIs. So you can see here's the bracket. We can see round 2, round 3, and now round 4, the quarterfinals. Because I'm not showing a far out view of the whole bracket, I will at the end of this video series. I'll tell you the quarterfinals are Turdz versus Jenna Angel from Digital Devil Saga 1 and 2, Lenneth Valkyrie from Valkyrie Profile versus the Gunnar from FF8, Lynx from Chrono Cross versus Tifa Lockhart from FF7, Yuri Hyuga from Shadow Hearts 2 versus Joka from Persona 5. Some of the AIs that have made it here are very strong, some are a bit weaker. Turdz' opponent is pretty strong. So the rule set for this round is going to be level 9, no rares and no A9s, and FF decks only. And I really don't like this rule set I made. I think I should have done a better job on this one. I'm pretty happy with all the others. I think FF only is not a very good stipulation. I think there's some really interesting things where you limit to very few decks, say like between 2 and 4. Probably more at the 4 range, where there's like a few options of like kind of different kinds of ways to go, you know, different decent options for each corner, but like nothing quite fits together near as well as you want, and it takes a little effort to kind of put a hand together that makes much sense. And otherwise, I think you generally want to open up to all the levels, you know, all the cards available, have you really be able to put together whatever cards you want to within the constraints of the other stipulations. And I think having more options, I usually prefer. I think you either want to have very few options or a lot of options. And FF only is kind of a middle ground I don't particularly like. I think I was just thinking, what's another stipulation I can do I haven't messed with? And I've decided I do not like it, and I will probably not have that as a stipulation in further tournaments I do. Maybe I'll have something like FF7 through 10 only or something like that, but not FF only. On the other part of it, the no A9s, I thought A9s tend to be the thing people go to on level 9, so if I get rid of them, it might make for more interest. And I think this was just something of me not thinking what comes next. And as Turdz says before the game, no A9s, no problem, go with A8s instead. I built this hand with some symmetry and a utility card to give myself a variety of both side and corner starter options, and to use cards that would play well off of each other in general. It looked like they had a similar idea, although notably the top and bottom cards were not exact opposites. Titan was a bit of a wild card, but could be powerful with 3 high numbers and a double number on a third side. And so you can see they both really went with A8s. Turdz on the right, I think, picks a better hand here. I think the A8 6s, the opposites, play off each other really well. Opposites in general, of course, play off each other well. But particularly on level 10, where there are 10s that can mean they same wall each other, or on kind of level 4, where like the 7-4 parts, for instance, can naturally plus wall each other, sort of feels a bit like level 10 in that way. I think particularly with those kind of sets, playing opposites is just very powerful. It's a little less powerful on kind of level 8, levels where the exact lineup opposites don't necessarily hit the natural plus walls against each other, right? 9-8-5-4s, for instance, are not going to naturally have, the 9 will be opposite a 4 or a 5, and that will not naturally plus wall an opposing 9. And of course, they do have synergies, the 9-8 parts, for instance, but especially on level 10, where the peak number is 10, or on levels where the peak number is 7, and there are lots of 4s around, opposites are, I think, especially powerful on those sets. So I think Turd's hand, which has more specifically opposite cards, is the better hand here of these two hands. But I think it also speaks to, as he said, no A9s, I'll go to A8s. And I think that is the right choice. And if we think, what if you knew your opponent was going to run all A8s? What would you do in response? Well, you can run A8s yourself, and that's going to be fairly neutral. But if you were trying to build a counter hand, it's pretty hard to think of what it would be. 9-9-7s comes to mind, because the 9-9s play well against the A, and the 9-7 parts plays well against the 8. But I think you're just going to end up with less power overall, and I'm not convinced it would be a good counter. And anything else is kind of horrible. Like 8-8s just don't play well against A8s. A8s can same wall them. The 8-8s don't end up having the advantage there. So I think overall the rule set kind of just says everyone's going to play with A8s, and that makes it a kind of not good rule set. And the 7-6-6-7s are interesting choices. because obviously they play better against A9s than A8s, but they're so clearly a very valuable utility card with their double numbers in both directions, and none of the A8s have this double number unless you went with something like an A8-4-4, which neither of the players went through with here. It makes sense to combine an 8 with a 6 because it can plus wall other 8s. So overall, I think these are the kind of hands that are just very likely to be chosen here, and I try to pick rule sets so far, at least, that I thought had more directions one could go. While here, I think the direction's pretty clear. So I'd love it if someone has thoughts like, nope, here's a hand that's really good on this rule set that isn't built on A8s, or isn't built on A8-6s even. If anyone has any ideas, I would be really interested. Or if you knew your opponent was going to spam A8s, how would you build a counter hand, right? We want, gaps of 2 to punish the 8s and double numbers, but like 7-5-7-5 isn't available here, and we probably wouldn't run it if it was because it's just much weaker power level. So I think it's very unclear what else you should do besides A8s. And so I think I did a poor job with the rule set. Anyway, I like Turd's hand. I think it has some advantage here. I decided to start in 6 as their hand looked weakest to the right. I also looked like I could take control if they decided to play in 3 or 9 due to how my cards played off each other. I also only needed to save 1 card for later in the game if they didn't play in 3 or 9 now, a common theme for these types of side starters. Yeah, so he has 1 card that both can recapture from both 3 and 9 and can take anything red puts in 3 or 9 in white 1A86. Which I think puts a lot of pressure on red, and red, due to only having A's up and down and no A's left or right, does not have any safe plays they can have. And they don't have any way to combo the blue capture card. If they go in 3 and it captures from 2, they don't have a combo in 1. And same if they put their card in 9 and it's captured from 8, they don't have a combo card in 7. They do sometimes, Jenna sometimes does have a combo in 5, right? If they go in 3 and Turdz takes with 1A86 and 2, they can plus in 5, but then Turdz can plus wall back in 1 and combo everything back. And all in all, it doesn't look like red has a good way to slide in comfortably next to the starter. Cleverly, they realized I had used up my power to the left and played a secure move. My first instinct in this position is to look at 5 and try to set something up, and actually here I did have A8-2-6, which set me up to capture the card in 1 both ways. However, a move like that would give up all of my upward power, and it looked like it led to a tie at best. I wanted to try something a bit different. So when looking at this game, I had just kind of automatically assumed Turdz was going to play the move in 5, setting up Odin to be able to same or plus in both 2 and 4 to great effect. But I think something interesting about Turd's style of play, and we're going to see this again in a later spot, and I'm not saying this is like a weakness in his style of play or anything like that, it was just something that struck me, was there were a lot of positions where I thought, here's a kind of more synergistic option. And Turd's thought, here is an option that retains or doesn't use up power that I'm going to need for later. And right here, the game has a somewhat upwards direction. There's a card in the top row. There's not a card in the bottom row. And Turdz wants to hold on A8-2-6, which he assumes will be powerful later due to its directional strength. And for me, maybe if I thought about the position for a while, I'd come to something different. But I was kind of just assuming A8-2-6 and 5 would be played because it seemed so synergistically correct and direct to set up that many pluses and sames. So I thought it was interesting he didn't play that here, and I think this is an interesting thing about Turd's style, is he really values directional capability. If the game is directed a certain way, he often, I think, has some bias. And of course, every good player will make certain moves the same, right? But that one of the maybe separating features of his style versus other good players might be a bias towards keeping power in the direction that he thinks the game will take on. And so, for instance, if we look at the last round, or a few rounds ago, when there were cards in 1, 7, and 9, and he made a move in 4 that he thought was somewhat against his style because it used up a lot of power in the direction of the game. Because there are cards in 1, 7, 9, that's going to direct the game down into the left, and he used up his down left quarter, and he felt that was a strange move for him to make. And I think if we look at him as someone who one of the defining features of his style as compared to other good players, his defining feature as compared to a not good player is just he makes much better moves, he calculates further, he has a better intuition. There are lots of differentiating features there. But compared to other good players, I think one of the defining things about his style might be that he has this real strong feel for the direction the game is going to have and wants to keep the appropriate cards for that. 7 is the more traditional spot to play, if not 5, but is much less value when you can't also capture 1 from 2. The move in 9 was to make them consider something different. Them responding in 8 looked like something I could take control from, whereas I had capture options on moves they could play in 3. So yeah, if Turdz is to go in 7, because he doesn't have a capture in 2, they could play in 4, and he potentially won't really have any captures at all. Though I guess he could capture anything that would be put in 4, but then he has to make sure that T works. And then here, his basic thought is, you can't play an 8, because if you do, I can combo back immediately or start setting stuff up. For instance, if Bahamut and 8, the only capture, I'm going to switch pronunciations between Bahamut and Bahamut, because I definitely hear other people say Bahamut, but I always thought in my head Bahamut, so now I just switch interchangeably between them and sound like a lunatic. So Bahamut and 8. Is Red's only capture of the card in 9, and that could be same walled back in 7, but then Jenna would have the option to plus in 5. So I think a more sensible option might be to meet Bahamut in 8 with something like Bahamut in 4, setting up Odin to have sames and same walls in both 5 and 7, and that looks pretty powerful to me. So it looks pretty dangerous for Red to capture in 8. Any move Red plays in 3 can be taken. You can see why this move, applies some pressure. And I think a lot of good play is kind of, where's the squares they want to play, and how can I prevent those squares being valuable? And looking at a move and kind of seeing the main line, if I go in 7 here, the most likely squares for them to go to are, say, 3 and 8, then quickly checking, they don't have good options there. They also, of course, have options in 2 and 4 to start locking in their safe card. But generally 2 concedes a safe square in 3, and here you'd have to set up a lot of synergy to make up for that I don't think Red really can set up. And going in 4 both allows S's, which might be dangerous, you have to check them, and potentially a move in 8, locking in that card in 9. Despite what I just said, for some reason I didn't consider this move properly. It was probably their best way out of that position. I certainly wasn't going to capture 3 from 2 now, and they didn't set me up to take 1 either. From here it seems sensible to just see the game out safely and go again. So blue only has 1 capture, Bahamut in 2, and that can be comboed back by Carbuncle, a 2, 6, 8, and 5, which can then be samed by 6, 6, 7, 7, and 8, but then it can be samed back by Bahamut in 4, and everything flips back, and you can calculate out to the end of the line, and it does not look profitable to take that card. So instead, Turdz plays here. I gave up the only card that could capture in 2, but I didn't want to do that anyway. I could have played the same card in 5, but that didn't win at this stage. I found this move and following ones quite easy to calculate out, though. I think the abundance of similar numbers in both hands makes that simpler. It was clearly headed for a tie. Yeah, it is sort of curious, these games with A8 6-2s. And I think Turd's hand obviously has more synergy because he's using these opposite cards that Jenna's hand is not. But I think they can be like a little clunky, right? Sometimes they line up really well, like Bahamut and Odin. The A8 2-6 and the 2-6 A8 are just always going to have tons of pluses and combos off each other. But somehow the way the cards lined up this game, there wasn't that much combo potential as it turned out. And it ended up being these kind of, powerful cards, often just not having squares to play in that fit cleanly. But I think, a well-played game. And Red plays in 5, and this one is pretty clearly a tie. Blue has no captures, and Red will always be either able to capture one thing or not be captured to end the game with a tie. So, tie confirmed. Turd's thoughts on the game are, I think we both played quite well. I agree. But I needed to wake up a bit in the next game because my play was quite reactive. While I didn't feel under any real pressure, they made moves that put the pressure on me to find out. That said, I didn't ever feel like I'd lose this game. I didn't ever really think I'd win either. Alright, same hands, let's go. There was no point in playing the same starter, as it would have almost certainly led to an identical game. this is true. My AI always, has a rule, a list of rules it follows, and it will always lead to one specific move. And so while if it is given the same setup or the same formation, it will often find a different move depending on the cards it has and the cards on the board and the cards you have. If you give it the exact same situation, the same cards in each hand, the same cards on the board, and the same squares, it will always play the same move. So if Turdz had played the same move, we could have easily had the same tie. Though it should be noted, this happened with humans too, right? Seto and Sujiro, for instance, have played tournament games where they just played out the same game with the same hand over and over again. So this is not to say this is something the AIs are doing that humans don't. Though humans doing it will often be looking and thinking, okay, so maybe that first game I start 6, you go 1, maybe this time I try the move in 5 instead of the move in 9 and see if that works any better. But if you decide it doesn't, then you often do end up playing the same. And I'm sure lots of good players have played out the same time multiple times in tournament games. This time I decided to play the same card in 3, leaving them without the option to reply in the same way as they did last time. Of the corner options I had, this one was the most sensible, as I could naturally recapture from both sides, and they couldn't. I really like the mindset of starters of kind of what's something more comfortable for me than it is for them. And just generally corners that I can take back comfortably 2 ways and they cannot are appealing. I didn't really expect this response. The way they played the first game made me think they were a defensive player, but this is a classic adjacent corner response, the kind that I used to play quite often myself, and that had set up a capture in the spot they couldn't take naturally with a high out-facing number. I'd usually look at 7, 9, and 8 here in that order, and didn't see anything that fit my hand very well. I'd considered 2, 6, A8, and 8, which would give perfect capture ability in 7, 9, and 5. But it would also give up 9 for free to their A8, 2, 6. Therefore, I felt I had to look at other spots here. I was also conscious that in an upward-facing game, my remaining hand was quite weak on top. So again, you'll notice a focus on the directionality of the game, which is, of course, a very important focus. And also, I think the most interesting thing Turdz says here is that the order of squares he looks at. So first of all, he's looking at the squares that don't give up a secure square, right? If you go in 5, there's a potentially secure square in 2. If you go in 4, there's a potentially secure square in 1 if they lock that in from 2. If you go in 6, 2 can lock in the card in 3, right? If you go in 2, then any of 4, 5, or 6 could potentially lock in a card. The only moves that don't allow the opponent to lock in a card are going to be 7, 8, and 9. And those are the 3 squares he looks at. But I then think the order he looks at them are interesting, where he starts with 7. And the reason you'd start in 7 as opposed to 9 is presumably you're already pretty well set up to retake your starter. That's often the reason why you played it, is because you're very well set up to take it. And so, but you're probably not near as well set up to take the corner they just played. That comes from their hand. That's not kind of part of your hand's preparation for the game. So looking at 7 first, 7 is going to be the square that impacts the card they just played in 1. So he checks that first. And then he checks 9 before 8, which suggests that he thinks the kind of 3-corner setup is better than what we've called the knight setup, where there are cards in 1, 3, and 8. Where the cards in 1 and 8 are a chess, knights jump away, and the card in 8 and 3 is again a chess, knights jump away. And I don't know if I ever had strong feelings about which was more promising, the 3 corners or the knight position. Probably I agree with Turdz that the 3 corners is the first one to check. So I just thought his order of kind of 7, the 3-corner setup that specifically attacks the card they just played, 9, the 3-corner setup that plays off the card I've played, and 8, the knight setup after, is a pretty interesting ordering that is worth thinking about. I think with some hands, you probably look at 9 before 7, because with some hands, you've designed your hand around this corner starter, and you have one card that can recapture, say, your corner starters in 3, you have one card that can recapture from 2, and a different card that can recapture in 6. And maybe you have a setup in your hand such that by playing in 9, your recapturer from 2 can also start setting up recaptures in 6. You have one card for both spots, which is especially important to have on first turn, because you also have last turn. Here, that's not really going to happen. So I like his order of thinking, and I thought it was kind of a interesting way of looking at the position. I ended up playing a move that I didn't actually use very often in real play. In non-combo games in most closed, this would usually be a bad move, as it presents a high risk of second turn, making a secured L on the next move. However, this served many purposes. It got a low top number out of my hand, defended in 5, and didn't give them any good setups to capture 2 from 5 without playing into my hands. So I've made a bunch of videos about the L and about adjacent corners, and talked about what I think the strategy is here, and I think this kind of move should be the default reply to the adjacent corner. Something high out facing towards 5 that is difficult for them to set up against, and as long as we can control second turn's moves in 5, it's going to be very difficult for them to push for a win and sometimes for them to manage a tie. So, but it is interesting because if you look at like closed non-combo, a move in 2 here is terrible because it gives up a secure card first and just absolute disaster. And I think a lot of players that played closed non-combo didn't really get this and would often play in 2 here, and it's just very bad on that rule set. And then when you move to open combo, suddenly a lot of the good players no longer play it because they've learned not to in the kind of rule sets you often play as you're starting out, and suddenly it starts being a better move again. And it's sort of this funny thing that happens, and you look at players that play a ton of closed combo, and they play some moves that look quite strange to me, right? Like, there's this standard idea in closed combo where there are cards in 1 and 4, and you go in 6. And this comes up, I think, fairly often in those games, but it's very rare in open combo. And there are all these ideas that pop up on one kind of form of triple triad and don't really pop up on others. And if you've specialized in some, like I'm a good closed combo player and a good closed non-combo player, a very good open combo player, but not as good, I think, at closed combo. And if you look at a really great closed combo player, they're going to have kind of formations in their lexicon of how they think about the game and how they attack certain positions that just don't come to mind for me. And I think this move in 2 is one that comes to mind for beginners, and they get punished for it when they're playing kind of level 4, same plus wall, right? Closed. And then it comes back and is in fact a really important type of move in open combo. For some reason, I thought they would play that same card in 6, but it actually suited them better in 4, as they could then at least recapture it in both sides. They were happy not to play for 2 from 5. My first instinct was to look at 1A8, 6, and 6, essentially securing both 3 and 2 for me. However, that gave them a win in 5. The same card in 5 instead, I think, was a tie, but I remember finding it quite difficult to calculate out. I think the more calculated calculations are ones where you have to remember a certain card has been used when looking more than one move ahead. I could only see ties and losses overall here. Yeah, I think that's a tough thing about triple triad. Just fundamentally, you're looking at your hand and you're calculating out these lines and you're calculating a bunch of different lines. And at the end, you realize you don't know whether this card is still in your hand or you just assume you can use a card twice. And I think this is just a really easy and common way to miscalculate that everyone did from time to time. And is probably one of the bigger reasons for calculation mistakes among pretty good players. I like these kinds of moves because they can catch people out who aren't paying attention. You might remember in the first game I spent most of my time before making a winning move thinking about a response of this type. To be honest, this one wasn't too difficult to get out of, but it did at least force a tie and leave a potential trap open. This is a very interesting move. So importantly, it does not concede any way for red to capture 2 from 5. And it says, if you go in 7, I get to go in 5, and I get to be the last one to access 4. And if you go in 5, I'm going to go in 7, and I'll be the last one to access 4. And I think it makes a lot of sense here. As I thought, it was pretty obvious this time they should defend 5. Even so, perhaps strangely, I found my move in 8 easier to calculate than if I'd gone in 5 instead. And we have a tie, because red can block 6 with Titus 7667, capturing the card in 3, and 6677 cannot capture back from 9. Another good game by both sides, with no mistakes made, and it looked like a tie was inevitable. My third move, as I said at the time, wasn't one I tended to play often, though I'm sure Waz will take this opportunity to give this style of play more credit than I did. I believe I've already given it more credit. However, compared to the last 2 rounds, given that the second game went quite differently to the first, I hadn't really managed to figure out enough about my opponent to go into the next game with a strategy to exploit. They just seemed like a good player that could vary their approach. So we reach game 3, and this time Jenna goes first for the first time. Alright, they changed up their hand. They still love that Titan, the 8199. The lack of A's on a level 9 hand is quite unusual, but I think I saw what they were going for here. Given A9s weren't allowed, the 9-9s would deal with A's, while the 9-7s would deal with 8s. May have been an attempt at a counterhand, given I mostly have even numbers. I did hope I'd be able to do something with those 1s at some point. Of course, a card with A's is going to be better at facing off against cards with the same numbers, right? Because it can same wall those 1s, while the cards with 1s that don't have an A cannot same wall back. I considered 8-6, 1A, and 9, first of all, which would give me a lot of control of the bottom right of the board if they ever did capture it or play... Oh, no, I'm skipped ahead. Sorry. I should play the first move. So, they're back to playing a high-value corner starter. It's a logical move, as they can recapture from both sides. I should say it's very similar to the starter I took advantage of in the second round. However, this time, my hand wasn't as equipped to deal with it. I considered 8-6, 1A, and 9, first of all, which would give me a lot of control of the bottom right of the board if they ever did capture it or play next to it. I decided on something else in the end. Will it go? There we go. Here I did to them pretty much what they did to me in the first game. Their only card that stood up to this was gone, and they didn't have a way of setting up to capture it that I couldn't easily defend. I had of course given up my capture in 4, which I was aware of when making my move, and it did give them the option to make a slightly unusual response in 8 if they wanted, which I also thought ahead for. So I thought this was a pretty interesting position because I spent a little time thinking what I thought red should do. And Turdz, of course, thought about what red should do, and the AI thought about what red should do. And we all thought about moves in 8, but we all thought about different cards there. So I'll say in advance, the AI played 7, 6, 6, 7, and 8, and we'll get to that in a bit. I had thought maybe 8, 1, 9, 9, or 1, 8, 9, 8, and 8, with the idea that either of those cards at least can be recaptured both ways, and I keep control of 9, so you don't have a safe move there, and that seemed to me the most plausible. Turdz, who, as I've said, I think has this bias towards making sure you have power in the direction of the game, sees red as thinking, okay, when I play an 8, the game is going to be downward directed, maybe specifically down right. And therefore, they should use their card that has the most power irrelevant to that fight. So Turd's instinct was 9, 7, 1, 9, and 8 would be red's move. And I thought it was interesting. We had different instincts. Mine was more about being able to recapture it. 9, 7, 1, 9 cannot be recaptured by red from 5. And Turdz's was making sure he had more, that the red player had more power in the direction of the game. And I think both are reasonable moves. And then the AI went with 7, 6, 6, 7, which is a whole different kind of thinking, which was very much more on the lines of, this is a card that can plus wall and stuff, but it doesn't really have targets on the board at the moment. And it has the most outfacing power of cards that can be recaptured both ways, right? The 9, 7, 1, 9 cannot be recaptured by red both ways. The other cards have 9 total outfacing power. The 7, 6, 6, 7 has 13. And that ended up being the reasoning behind the AI's decision. And I think it's a worse move than the other options in that square, which we'll get back to shortly. I thought they would use 9, 7, 1, 9, and 8 instead if they went there. 8, 6, 1A, and 6 was my planned response if they did. It's a very strange looking setup, but I love when it works out. Anyway, I looked at this move and thought, have they slipped up here? I'd actually quickly looked in 6 first, because that was my original plan, but then went to 9 and I could play A826 unopposed here and take full control of the right-hand side of the board. I spent a long time thinking this one over to make sure I didn't miss something obvious. I didn't want to rush into it, only to find it was intentional to give up 9. So actually, I want to go back and do a kind of lengthy calculation, but maybe if this is feeling like it goes long or something, and feel free to skip ahead a few minutes till you see a different position. But I thought it was a really interesting line. If red goes 9, 7, 1, 9, and 8, and Turdz goes with his idea of 8, 6, 1A, and 6. So what's the idea of that? First of all, it sets up 5, right? It sets up 6, 6, 7, 7 to have this plus in 5. And this is a really dangerous idea for red. In fact, I think, red's obvious move is then to take 9, because 9 is completely safe. And I think every move red has in 9 is losing due to 6, 6, 7, 7, and 5, which further sets up a plus in 4, so that's something suddenly red will have to defend, because 10 plus 7 equals 8 plus 9 with 1A8, 6. And I think that's just winning. So I think this is this interesting idea of if they go in 8, I go in 6, and I have it set up so any move they play in 9, I can win with a move in 5. But that sort of leads to the next thing to calculate, right? After the moves in 8 and 6, if I can't go in 9, if I'm red now, and I can't go in 9 because you have such a powerful thing in 5, what happens if I block 5? And I was really drawn to this because blue has used up their only capture in 9 of the card in 8. So normally 5 would just give up so many cards, right? Because a move in 9 is going to lock in the card in 8, it's going to lock in the card in 6. But here it won't, because it can't take the card in 8, so it won't lock that in. And that card in 6, if that card in 3 could be plussed or comboed in some way, it would flip the card in 6. So it's not really locking in that either. So I started thinking, what happens if red blocks 5 there? And there are 2 cards that come to mind as pretty strong to block 5 with. There's 8199, which sets up a plus with 7667 in 4, and with 7667 in 2. So that was the one I was really drawn to. But there's also 7667 in 5, which sets up 1898 in 2. And I think both of these are pretty dangerous, and I haven't calculated them out the whole way, and you can if you want to. But I just thought this was an interesting line where you see, okay, if I go 9, it's really dangerous that they can go 5. Therefore, what if I block 5 first? And then you start noticing, okay, that's not as bad as it first looks, because 8 is safe when it normally wouldn't be. And the card in 6 I have access to if I can set up a combo in 2. So that's less dangerous than it would normally be. I think 5's pretty good here. So I think red would have at least survived and maybe even pushed for a win if they went in 8, Turdz followed his idea in 6, and they played in 5 there. So continuing to the game. After satisfying myself that it was the right move, I went ahead with it. I genuinely wasn't sure what they would do here. Any capture in 5 would be comboed. Anything in 6 could be direct captured without risk. Other options didn't look especially great for them either. Had they just messed that up? I understand playing in 4. At least it makes me think beyond the easy paths I outlined on the last move. 6, 6, 7, 7, and 5 looked like a straight path to a win, though. I liked this one better, though. Gotta love those A1 combos. And I think it's pretty funny that either card red puts in 5, their 1 will be part of a same or a plus, a same or a plus, with their 1 that's outfacing. So I thought this was a pretty cute way to finish the game, and Turdz does in fact win and advances to the semifinals. I thought we'd played out 2 good, tough games, and I could see this was going to be a difficult opponent. However, I thought the third move in the third game was a gift, but it's still up to the other player to gratefully accept such a gift. I felt like I'd put some good pressure on with my response to their starter in any case, but it was far too early to say I thought I would have won from there otherwise. I'd have liked to have had the chance to play out my move in 6 to what I thought they would play in 8, as it's an unusual setup that seeds 9, but I thought it looked very strong for me. Regardless, for a quarterfinal, you take any chances you can to win a game. Yeah, I think this is kind of the way games are often won, where, you have 2 good players and you play a couple ties and maybe you get a little pressure, and eventually at some point someone makes a move that's just a little weird, and this move in 8 conceded 9 and Jenna missed that possibility, and suddenly I think the move in 8 was the losing move. I think the move in 9 was a forced win, and Turdz goes on to win and advances to the semifinals, which we will do in the next video. Hope you enjoyed this one. Sorry if that was a long pause to go calculate down some weird lines, but I thought it was a very strange and offbeat position. And congrats on his semifinals. Can he make it to the finals?